Have you seen it recently? I furrowed my eyebrows before speaking, fully intending to lie. Seen what? I replied, dumbly. My psychiatrist paused. Mallory, she said, in that tone she always did before reminding me how important it was to tell the truth. You won't get better if you don't work with me here. I can only tell you what to do if I know what's going on. Dr. Lucy was more difficult to evade than my previous psychiatrists. It was as if she could peer directly into my mind. Her questions a mere formality. I kept my silence, acknowledging the futility of answering. She nodded, pulling out her all-too-familiar script pad. I'm going to up the clozapine. It really should be effective at this dose, but there's a great degree of individual variance in how people metabolize it, she decided, eager to offer an explanation of my non-response that did not suggest I was a lost cause. I'd been seeing shadows, rather, a single recurring shadow, ever since my father became a city councillor. The silhouette was tall, dark, and unmoving. It scared me by virtue of its appearance, but otherwise did not bother me. I approached home, the front of the lot a showy display of wealth and meticulous property management. Carefully trimmed hedges lined the stonework pathway to the freshly painted front door and its carefully polished door glass. As was routine, I fed my cat and let him outside the back door. I briefly noticed the untrimmed hedges and weed-laden lawn. Like my dad always said, the back of the property was lined with thick trees and not visible to neighbors, so it required less maintenance. Still crazy, or no? My dad, chipper as always, asked with a friendly, bright white smile and unfriendly look in his sharp blue eyes. His childish and ill-intentioned teasing contrasted heavily with his freshly pressed chinos, iron shirt, and polished shoes. You know I don't like it when you say it like that, I responded curtly. He shrugged. Just preparing you for the real world. If you don't learn to hide the mental stuff, you'll be eaten alive, he said, looking out the window into the backyard. Or just sent to a ward. He added the last sentence as a reminder of his leverage over me. He'd threatened several times to have me admitted into a psychiatric facility if I didn't improve. I figure it's an empty threat because, if nothing else, his public image would suffer if word got out that he had a lunatic daughter. Don't worry. I wouldn't threaten your campaign chances, I said, unable to resist the temptation of getting the last word. He sneered at me much like a passerby would look at vomit on the sidewalk, and left the room. You're expropriating the church? I asked in disbelief. Is that even legal? Sure it is, he said, cracking open his 2-millionth beer of the evening. The building itself is great, but its patrons are an eyesore. He took another swig with a smug, satisfied grin. He continued, The world is better off without the fucking crackheads and alcoholics. That building will be put to much better use now. The church and its parish had been unpopular among the upper-class NIMBYs because it served as a homeless shelter, needle exchange, and other undesirable facilities. These resources were essential for helping the homeless, but were unsightly, and my father couldn't have that, not within his jurisdiction. And what will it be used for now? I asked, prying for the ulterior motive. I was thinking it would make an excellent venue for this year's Graham Lake Community Fundraiser. Disappointment welled in my gut. The event had once been an occasion focused on raising money for single mothers and included lottery draws, auctions, and the opportunity to pay money to throw fruit or pies at politicians. It was an extremely popular event. Over the years, it slowly turned into a media fluffing for the political elite of the city, who did away with the messiness of the food throwing, quietly began misappropriating the raised funds, and tripled the time dedicated to speeches and position statements. The substance of the event had been gutted to polish the optics. "I'm sure the homeless and the starving agree," I said, getting up. He winced at the word homeless like a cockroach had run across his foot. His expression shifted as he conjured up a retort. "Right. Well, say hi to your shadow buddy for me. I put a beer in the fridge for him," he said with a laugh, always his own biggest fan. My cheeks burning red, I closed my bedroom door behind me and saw it. It stood in the back left corner of my room. I froze at the closed exit, my hands pressed against the door. The room smelled like smoke. Wide-eyed, I tried to make out its features. The silhouette turned its head as it noticed me. I began to panic as it moved towards me, and I only partially calmed down when it opened my closet door and soundlessly slipped inside the door. I was left alone with its remnant odor and my pounding chest. I opened up my bag to try my new prescription of clozapine. "Cheers to that, my friend," my dad said, donning a wide and friendly smile as he raised his glass. It was time for the Graham Lake Community Fundraiser. In unmistakable irony, the now vacated church that no longer served its community's homeless would be the new venue for the event, its stained glass, acoustics, and wide space serving as primary attractions. Listless and disinterested, I looked around. It looked a bit like a wedding reception. There were rows of white tables with arranged seating. The room was divided between political representatives and local constituents. Metal gates like those you'd see at a concert explicitly depicting the gap between the city's politicians and their people. At the back of the room, 2 large doors led to the outside. I noticed the doors were ajar, allowing a small view of the sidewalk outside. There was a large turnout this year. Hundreds of people had come for the fundraiser, and thousands more were likely watching the broadcast. It was a great PR opportunity for my father, who'd prepared a small speech for me to deliver. I still hadn't read it. "We're up. Come on," my father said giddily, excited for his turn to speak. He liked having me up there with him. He liked to say that having a daughter made him appear more trustworthy and relatable to the public eye. I often wondered if that was the only reason he'd married my mom and had me. "Ladies and gentlemen of Graham's Lake, it is my absolute honor." He paused for effect before continuing, gripping the sides of the lectern that once held books of song and worship to something greater than oneself. "To be this year's keynote speaker. Truly, a great joy for me and my family. Everyone please, a round of applause for the dedicated organizers of this year's event," he said, starting the applause himself by clapping into the microphone. Knowing the drill, I clapped along while looking at him and faking a proud smile, remembering that when one of those same organizers told him he couldn't speak for longer than 10 minutes, he'd told them to fuck themselves and hired an unpaid intern in their place. As he continued his speech, I noticed an unkempt, bearded man at the door. Behind him, across the street, the tall, dark figure stood. I quickly returned my attention to the bearded man, not wanting to acknowledge the familiar apparition. The man appeared to be asking for food. Security was blocking his way in, which upset the man, who proceeded to spit on one of the security officers. My gaze switched to my father as I saw him whisper words into a microphone under his suit jacket. The order given, the man was immediately tased and his mouth covered as the guards dragged him away from the door and, crucially, out of sight. As the guards walked by, they blocked my sight of the dark figure, which disappeared as the man passed. I watched in silent dismay, keeping my smile. I glanced at my father, who'd taken another pause in his speech, using the power of silence to emphasize his points. I saw that he'd witnessed the same exchange I had, and in stark contrast to my defeated eyes, his gleamed with excitement. He loved it. I tuned back into his speech. I'd now like to invite my daughter, Mallory, to give a speech. She has recently taken an interest in public office. I have not. And I thought this was a perfect opportunity to show her face. Mal, take it away, he said, stepping away from the lectern and guiding me towards it with a firm hand on my back. His touch was foreign to me, as was the new nickname he'd used to feign a deeper relationship with me for the audience. Still shaking from what I had just witnessed, I looked down at the speech for the first time and began reading. I am so proud of my father, I began, replacing the word daddy. Unbelievable. I went on. Just a few years ago, this church housed vagrants. I stopped, surprised but quickly continued. And now it houses our city's best and brightest for a celebration of dignity and charity. I read the words, pause for applause, and tears welled in my eyes. My father's cruel and disingenuous words coming from my mouth. I added, may the funds raised today bring food to the lips of many hungry families and essential medical care to the children who need it. Just another gesture from your city councillor, a true shepherd of your best interests. I trailed off as my gaze wandered back to the open doors. The aforementioned bearded man was back, now bloodied and unconscious, and being dragged into a police car. The silhouette was back in its place across the street, and watched as the man was loaded into the police car. I felt blood rush in my ears. I'd worked for years, against my will, to maintain my father's image. I appeased him to protect myself. And for what? The abuse never stopped. I felt like a caged animal whenever my father uncapped a beer. I had undergone years of therapy, and still saw things that weren't there, including that goddamn shadow I could still see through the open doors. Now, I witnessed a cruel display of violence that was made possible and actively covered up by my own complicity and willingness to say my father's words. The anger squeezing my chest, I looked away from the script and towards the crowd, donning a snarl of disgust. Unless you're homeless, in which case, eat shit, or don't eat, who cares? I declared, my voice wavering but matter of fact. We certainly don't. Look what we did to this church. It met an important need for a vulnerable popul— I kept speaking, but the microphone was cut. My father looked at me, sternly and with obvious surprise. I left the stage briskly and saw the silhouette disappear behind the front door, which was still ajar. My father stepped to the microphone to add some damage control. My sincere apologies for my daughter. As many of you know, she is not always sound of mind. May I direct your attention to the open bar to the left of the stage? And followed after me. I didn't know where I was going, but it had better be quick. I was sobbing in fear and shame of my father and his dehumanizing closing statement. Without a plan, I ran down the steps, To the basement, I guess. I turned on the lights, which flickered several times before illuminating the hazy space. The bottom level of the church was dilapidated. The drooping ceiling showed obvious signs of water damage, animal and insect infestation, and general neglect. The whole thing smelled like smoke. The floor was littered with garbage and boxes that had not been tidied since the parishioners had been evicted from the building. Seeing the packages of wasted sterile needles, first aid kits, and now spoiled food, I wondered if anyone else knew that the pristine display upstairs was propped up on a corrupted foundation. The familiar shadowy figure stood opposite the room to me. It seemed taller. Too tall to be human. I blinked, and it disappeared. Mallory? What the fuck was that? My father spit through gritted teeth, barely keeping the volume of his words down. He grabbed my arm and bore a cruel gaze into my eyes. I felt a chill down my spine as I was paralyzed with fear, his stare immobilizing me. Do you have any idea what people will think? Fuck, Mallory. Does my position mean nothing to you? I pay for all your fucking therapy, food, shelter. What the fuck else do you want? It's unbelievable. I don't know how you... He stopped his tirade, looking away for a few seconds. He looked back at me with a deep sense of clarity in his face. The speed with which he switched from uncontrollable rage to serene calm was chilling. My daughter, he said, his maniacal nature just barely poking through the surface of his contrived disposition. That was an impassioned display. You're just like me, after all. It's almost a shame that nobody will ever see you again. He smiled, clearly relishing his threat, as my vision tunneled in that way it does when you enter the early stages of shock. I felt my heart race as my father reached for the same microphone in his suit jacket as before, and I knew my fate as an inpatient was sealed. Prepared to give the order, my father choked on his words, uncharacteristically. His usual charisma was replaced with fear. I'd never seen that look in him before. Seeing that fear in him, I felt a sick sense of satisfaction, but that was quickly replaced with fear of my own, as I realized his gaze was fixated at the far end of the room where I'd previously seen the tall figure. I looked over to see what had caught his attention. The pitch-black creature loomed with an ominous stillness. It was so tall it had to hunch at the waist under the 8-foot ceiling. It was humanoid with unnaturally thin arms and legs, the former hanging limply in front of it like a praying mantis. Despite these features, it clearly was not biological in nature. It was surrounded by a grey, ashy mist that smelled strongly of sulfur. There was no evidence that it was breathing, or even that it needed to. Its face had no features, sporting only a porcelain-like smoothness, similar to a mannequin. Despite not having eyes, it clearly had its gaze fixated on my father, who was equally fixed in place as he struggled to understand the infernal entity in front of him. The being turned its head and looked at me briefly. Somehow, I understood that I had permission to leave, and I felt the impetus to move briskly to the stairs. When I reached the stairs' entrance, I looked back. I witnessed the pursuit at an angle perpendicular to the creature's path towards my father. I watched as it lowered its hands to the ground. As it started to crawl, it cocked its head mockingly, not once releasing its stare from the flawed man before it. It moved soundlessly, its ashy aura filling the basement like a crematorium. My father began a futile sprint towards the stairs, towards me. I looked down from the steps as his pleading eyes met my apathetic stare. In a smooth motion, and without breaking stride to its original destination, the emotionless being merely followed my father's movement with its gaze, reached out its arm, and clamped its long fingers around my father's ankle like a bear trap. There was a stomach-turning crunch as my father helplessly yelped in pain. It walked towards a door at the other side of the room, dragging the pale-faced man in tow as the latter made desperate attempts to escape the cryptid's grip. The journey from one end of the room to the other felt like an eternity. As it finally disappeared behind the door, I noticed that a necrosis had begun creeping up the Machiavellian city councillor's limbs from the point of contact with the demon's hand. Screaming, my father made one last desperate attempt to break free by crawling at the floor. Before he had even disappeared through the frame, his limbs had impossibly appeared to have undergone rigor mortis, but his eyes were still frantically looking for a salvation that would never come. Like so many beautiful things he'd ruined, my father disappeared.